Hello, everyone. It's my honor to be here today and to lead this very distinguished panel. As you've heard, this week in March of 1876 was a real inflection point, not only for Alexander Graham Bell and the history, but also for the history of communications. Today, we're going to talk about Bell's journey to securing his patent for the telephone in 1876 and what that means for us today. I'm honored to lead this esteemed panel who will help us understand who Bell was and how that story informed this pivotal innovation. As president-elect of IEEE, I represent a global organization of technologists, and Alexander Graham Bell was one of our founders of IEEE, so it's my honor to be up here today. So we're going to start out and hear from our panelists. And I'm going to start with Ed Grosvenor here beside me. Welcome. I know you are a Bell descendant. Can you tell us about Bell's family background in elocution and deaf education and the influence of this on the development of the telephone?
Thank you. Yes, he was the third generation of his family involved in teaching elocution, how to speak better. His father was actually the model for Henry Higgins in My Fair Lady. And he wrote 10 books about how to speak better, which was very popular with Victorian England, where people were trying to speak the King's English. His youth, it's very interesting to me how, as a boy, his play really influenced his later career. One of the things he did was, as a young teenager, he built a talking head out of a skull, some rubber lips, bellows for lungs, and it makes very strange sounds. Being a teenager, he used it mostly to scare his neighbors, but his father, Melville Bell, was very interested in visible speech and trying to write down how, and they got into very detailed arguments over how you create vowel sounds and the components. So Alec had an argument with his father. He actually stuck tuning forks down his throat and to get the resonances and then noted them down. And he wrote a whole report at age 19 that was transformed what they thought about vowels at the time. And he was elected to a prestigious science society at age 19. So.
Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those stories. That's what makes this real, is when you hear stories like this. So turning now to Brian Wood, who is joining us virtually. I hope you can see him over there from Canada. You dedicated your livelihood to preserving the Bell Homestead in Brantford, Ontario, for decades before you just recently retired. Tell us how the Bell family came to Canada in the early 1870s and how that helped him come up with the idea of the telephone.
Thank you, Jill. Great to be here. So the Bell family in 1870 were living in London, England. They were originally from Edinburgh, but by this point they had moved to London. And Mel, Bill, and Eliza Bell, the inventor's parents, had lost their youngest son at age 18 in 1867, their grandson, also an Edward, and their oldest son, Melville, who passed away in 1870 at age 25, all from tuberculosis. And at this point, their middle son, Alec, was not well, and they feared he was showing signs of the illness as well. Melville had been to Canada in the 1840s when his own health was not great. I had come to Newfoundland to escape the rotten air of Edinburgh and searched for better health in the bracing climate here in Canada. So he hoped that moving to Canada would do the same for his son. He had a close family friend living not far from Brantford at the time here in Ontario and asked for suggestions on where they might find a suitable home. And Reverend Henderson, as he was known, found them a 10.5-acre farm just outside of Brantford that provided Alec with the surroundings that really helped him recover over that first fall and winter that they were here. Melville Bell, as Ed mentioned, he was not a farmer, he was a teacher. So that first fall and winter were a big learning curve for him. He took on a 10.5-acre farm with 2.5 acres of fruit orchard, and they were raising almost 60 animals a year here. So this was entirely new to them, but they were most concerned about providing Alec with a place that he could get fresh air and peace and quiet. And by the next spring, he was quite well and was offered a teaching position at the Boston School for the Deaf in Massachusetts. And from that point on, he would teach in Boston and then return home to Brantford for the summers and again at holiday time, and was in Brantford with his parents in the summer of 1874 when he discovered the basic principle upon which the telephone would work, the principle of undulatory current. So Brantford really became for him, as he liked to call the family home, his dreaming place. He was the type of person that needed absolute quiet to work out his ideas, and the surroundings of the farm provided him that. And he discovered that basic principle on the slope at the back of the farm overlooking the Grand River. So he was able to escape from the hustle and bustle of Boston and his work, coming home to Brantford each summer and again at Christmas time, and continuing to develop that theoretical and conceptual work that eventually became the telephone.
Thank you, Brian. At times we all need a place of escape, that dreaming place. And now next for Sheldon Hochheiser, also joining us virtually. I'd like you to tell us a bit about Bell's relationship with the Hubbards of Cambridge. I know that Bell taught Gardner Hubbard's deaf daughter Mabel and ended up falling in love with her. What influence did she have on Bell?
Well, let me start by building on some of what Brian said. In addition to teaching at a school for the deaf, Bell took private patients. Typically, these would be, they're well-to-do people with deaf children. And that's how he gets involved with the Hubbards. Gardner Hubbard, member of a wealthy, well-established Boston family, also a prominent attorney. He hires Alec to come and tutor his daughter, who was about 15 at the time when they started, and they fell in love. Hubbard also was very interested in the telegraph and became the top person in trying to influence Congress to set up a postal telegraph system to compete with the Western Union telegraph monopoly. So Hubbard was wealthy, Bell was not, and as he fell in love, it became clear that Hubbard wanted to make sure that his daughter would be able to maintain a style of life that she was used to. So he, of course, knew a lot about speech and sound, as you've already heard. And Hubbard suggested that he should look into electricity. That was the leading edge technology. And the main thing was the Western Union telegraph system. So Hubbard, at his encouragement, Bell started hanging around at a telegraph equipment shop and learning about electricity. He went down to Washington to the Smithsonian, whose secretary, Joseph Henry, was America's top physical scientist. And he learned. Hubbard encouraged him to try to come up with a harmonic telegraph to send multiple telegraph signals down a single wire. This would be an invention that would be of great interest and make a lot of money and be a suitable spouse for Mabel. But what Bell was really interested in was, as we already heard, teaching the telegraph wires to speak, to have a conversation. And indeed, if you look at the details of his patent, you'll find that both things are discussed.
Thank you, Sheldon. I do want to remind everybody that there's an exhibit up in the atrium, and up there you will actually see a portion of a love letter that Bell wrote to Mabel. So make sure you check that out before you leave. So we've talked a little bit about Bell's background. We're going to move on to talking about the patent. And I'm going to start out with Josh Levy, who hasn't had a chance yet to speak here. While Bell summered in Brantford in the 1870s, he was working as a teacher of the deaf in Boston. And like many other electrical inventors, he was simultaneously trying to invent a system for sending multiple telegraph messages. Josh, can you set the scene for us as Bell starts to imagine this device and what would eventually become the telephone? What problem was he trying to solve?
Well, Bell was trying to solve a problem that many inventors of the time were trying to solve. They were trying to increase the capacity of the telegraph network. And Bell hoped to do that using his capacity for understanding sound, which was exceptional. He wanted to create something called a harmonic telegraph. So he was working on that while he was also acting as a professor of elocution and as a teacher of the deaf, and playing with other devices as well, including one that he hoped could represent sound visually for his deaf students to be able to understand what sounds were coming out of their mouths when they spoke. And the telephone was a kind of a side project of a side project. He came up with this conception. The speech that we just saw from Bernie has written about this, of Bell as a kind of top-down inventor, as opposed to Edison, who was more of a bottom-up inventor. Edison liked to fiddle with things at his work table and come up with ideas that way. Bell would come up with a concept, and then he would, either alone or with other people that had skills that he didn't have, he would develop that idea. So the idea as he had framed it was that when you send a message across a telegraph wire, the current is intermittent. It starts and stops as the telegraph sends. He believed that if you could send what he called an undulatory current that goes up and down and is continuous, that you could transmit vocal speech that way. So that's the concept that he starts out with and his initial vision. And then he pursues it from there.
So to continue with you, Josh, I understand there were several drafts of the patent before it was actually submitted, or maybe as it was being submitted. What happened when the application arrived at the patent office?
There were multiple patents. Bell was attempting to seek a British patent first. He wanted to get the British patent so that he could then get the American patent and it wouldn't jeopardize his patent rights in the UK. And so he drafted a version for the British, he drafted another version for the Americans, and he sent it to Gardner Hubbard, his future father-in-law. And Hubbard had it with him in Washington for a couple of weeks. Then Hubbard had it hand-delivered to the patent office. And famously, Elisha Gray, one of Bell's competitors, had delivered a caveat to the patent office at the very same day, a few hours later. And what actually happened to the patent office that day became a subject of great controversy later on in the patent disputes. My role here is as the curator of the Bell papers at the Library of Congress, so we have Bell's perspective on things. What Bell knows is that he has drafted this patent. He sent it to his lawyer and to Hubbard. They both say it looks good. It's delivered to the patent office a few weeks after Gardner receives it in Washington. And then Bell is called in to clarify some things for a patent examiner who's looked at it and is also looking at the other patents that are similar that have arrived at the same time. And then Bell gets the patent. And there's many rumors that circulate later about other things that went on, but that's mostly what's documented in Bell's own writings.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go back to Brian now. I understand that while Americans celebrate Bell's first phone call from March 1876, Canadians are also equally proud of the practical demonstration that Bell gave in Brantford in the summer of 1876. Why is the Brantford demonstration important?
So by the summer of 1876, Bell was ready to test his telephone over longer distances, keeping in mind that the March 10th test was between two rooms. So coming home to Brantford that summer, he brought with him his third telephone. So in total, he developed 3 different models. The March telephone was the liquid transmitter, but he went back to using electromagnets with his third transmitter. So he brought home what he called the double-pole membrane transmitter and his iron box receiver. Coming home that summer, he approached the Dominion Telegraph Company here in Brantford about using their existing lines. And at first was refused. The manager of the local company took Bell's letter, crumpled it up, threw it in the garbage. Another gentleman working in that same telegraph office pulled it out of the garbage, sent it further down the line, and Bell was granted permission to use the lines. So he undertook 3 tests here in August. The first one on August the 3rd was done strictly in private. He had attempted a long-distance test in Boston. It was deemed to have failed in July. So before he did anything publicly this time, he wanted to make sure that everything was working properly. So this test used a telegraph line between the Brantford Telegraph Office in about 4 miles from the Bell's home, a line that ran up the Mount Pleasant Road adjacent to their road and into a village called Mount Pleasant. And that evening, Bell and his Uncle David, his father's brother, transmitted from Brantford to Mount Pleasant. And that became the first successful test between 2 communities. The next night, Bell's parents, Melville and Eliza, were throwing a very lovely outdoor dinner party in honor of his Uncle Edward, who was here from Australia. is his mother's brother. And so because of the nature of the guest that evening, many local businessmen, many local politicians, Alec decided that was a good time to demonstrate it as well. So first he and his cousins demonstrated his phone on a line between the house and their carriage house right on the property. But he had also made arrangements to use that same Brantford to Mount Pleasant telegraph line once again. He spent part of the day stringing a 1/4 mile of wire off the house and along the farm fences to the end of the road to connect into the Mount Pleasant line. That evening after supper, he and some ladies, his cousins and so on, met in the telegraph office, and they put a concert on in the telegraph office, and the guests up at the Homestead listened to it with his receiver out on the front veranda. So not a public demonstration again, but a successful demonstration. A week later, Alec was ready to demonstrate to the public for the first time. He made arrangements with the Dominion Telegraph to use their line between Brantford and the town of Paris, so about 8 miles. Transmitter was wired in at Brantford, receiver wired in at Paris. He realized partway through the day that he didn't have enough battery cells in the Brantford Telegraph office to transmit the distance. So he made arrangements to have extra battery power wired down the lines from Toronto. So the circuit that night was 68 miles. Bell was on the receiving end of the line. He was in Paris. And the first voice that he heard coming through was most definitely his Uncle David. The next voice that came through the line sounded more like his father, Melville, which Alec understood would not be there that night. Clearly, Melville was either feeling left out or felt this was more interesting than what he was doing, so he walked into town and became the second speaker. And it was clear enough at the Paris end of the line that Alec understood it to be his father. Again, it was public. Anybody could attend. The 2 telegraph offices that night, both in Brantford and Paris, were jammed with people. Probably 80% of them thought he was right off his rocker. The test was only to be half an hour. That is all Dominion Telegraph gave him to use the lines. It went on for 3 hours that night because, of course, then all of the people that saw the success of this test wanted to try it. That became the world's first successful long-distance telephone call and was truly the night that Alec proved the telephone was a practical form of communication that might replace the telegraph.
Thank you for that. I love also the involvement of family. It just threaded through that entire story. And so I'm going to turn this next question over to Ed. In retrospect, it seems remarkable that Western Union, who controlled the telegraph network, turned down the opportunity to buy Bell's patent. Can you give us any insights or explain that decision?
Well, Hubbard had been one of the main lobbyists trying to break the monopoly of Western Union. So there was a lot of friction between Hubbard and Western Union. But the problem was they had this phone that worked, but now what do? They need thousands of miles of copper wire, which was very expensive. And so one idea was, well, why don't we sell it to Western Union? And they took it to Western Union and offered it, and Western Union, William Wharton, the president who disliked Hubbard, said, absolutely not. We have making much more money with the telegraph. So it's one of the great examples of bad business decisions.
That's great. Thank you. I actually have a couple of extra minutes. Sheldon, was there any short thing about the patent that you wanted to add? Any comments about the patent?
I think it's been very well described. The big thing I would add is to get into the history of the patent. And that is under U.S. patent law until last 20 years, it's date of discovery, not date of filing paperwork with the patent office. So one way to test a patent in court was to try to demonstrate that somebody else got there first. So this litigation, once you have the commercialization of the patent, which we'll talk about later, other people wanted to go into the telephone business, except they couldn't because they were infringing on the patent rights granted in the March 7th patent and in the second patent the following year. And there were over 600 cases brought by the commercial Bell interests. I think they lost one on a technicality. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which ruled that Mr. Bell had indeed invented the telephone and that it was indeed a basic patent because of the undulating current, which you've already heard about with the basic theoretical underpinnings.
Thank you, Sheldon. And we're going to move on now to talking about the impact. And I do want to point out that there is a microphone in the middle of the room. And at the end, if we have time, we are going to have questions from the audience. We can take a few questions. So if you're going to come up with a question, you can move over there and at any time, and I'll give a little bit more instructions as we get closer to that. But Sheldon, as a former historian, AT&T, can you share with us how several entrepreneurs, starting with Bell's father-in-law, Hubbard, joined with Bell to form the Bell Telephone Company, and some other information about how they got started? Who were the first customers?
Okay. Well, first off, the number of financial backers is 2. It took money for Bell to do these experiments. And of course, the time he was spending working on these experiments, he wasn't earning money teaching deaf people, teaching elocution. So there are 2 backers. One was Hubbard, and there was a second backer who backed in, Thomas Sanders, who again, Bell got to know because Sanders hired Bell to be a private tutor to his child who was deaf. So when the first company was formed, the Bell Telephone Company in 1877, direct ancestor of today's AT&T, there were 7 stockholders. Hubbard, Sanders, Maple Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, Thomas Watson, and 2 other close relatives. That's where it begins. Those are the financial backers who formed the initial Bell Telephone Company. I can go on from there, but I'll leave that up to you, Jill.
I think we should go ahead and move on. Thank you for that. If we have time left over at the end, maybe we can come back to that question. We'll see how many audience questions we get also. But I'll move on to Ed again. Expanding the telephone network over long distances and increasing capacity relied on many other innovations like loading coils and switchboards by a whole host of companies and inventors. It's a very rich and complex story. Can you pick out a couple of the most important and explain their significance?
Well, it was a long way from speaking one way from a transmitter into a receiver in the next room. To get it long distance and then also within a city, it was very difficult to create these networks. They set up the first telephone to the White House in May of 1877. Rutherford B. Hayes was the first president to talk on the telephone. The problem was the telephone line didn't go anywhere because nobody else had telephones. The following year, they set up the National Telephone Company, and we actually have a copy upstairs of the first telephone directory. It's only 1 page.
Oh, wow.
The White House was number 1. Congress was number 2. Hubbard made his own house number 6. But very quickly, you can imagine if you're a banker and you have a telephone and your customers are using it, all the other bankers want to have it. And so it grew really quickly.
If I can add a little bit to this, that's the early history of the telephone in Washington. But how did you get to that? So Gardner Hubbard wanted to commercialize the telephone. And the initial thing in Washington, first lines were just point to point. But how do you spread it around the country? Well, what Bell did is what we'd call franchising, the original Bell Telephone Company. That is, they licensed a group of business people in cities and towns across the United States to operate a telephone business under license from the patent holder. The patent holder being, by 1881, that was called the American Bell Telephone Company. And then you get hundreds and hundreds, thousands of innovations, starting with George Coy in New Haven, Connecticut, who devised the first telephone switchboard in 1878, so that anybody connected to the central office could talk to anybody else rather than just the initial point-to-point situation. By the early 1880s, there were telephone exchanges operating under license from the Bell, what's now the American Bell Telephone Company, in just about every place in the United States with more than 10,000 people.
Thanks, Sheldon.
Can I
Yeah,
add one
go
thing?
ahead, Ed.
When we were researching my book on Bell and the history of the telephone industry, we found something very rare, which was a picture of a telephone exchange, and it was all men. Because very quickly they discovered, because the phone's service was so difficult, there was so much crackling and interference, so frustrating for the customers, they got pretty hot. There were a lot of hot conversations, and they found that women were just much better at calming down the customers. And so very quickly, the telephone companies hired women, and it was really, along with teaching, one of the first major professions that young women could go into.
I remember seeing lots of old pictures of women telephone operators. Thank you. So Josh, we got a little bit of a preview of this, but can you provide us a perspective on how the usage of the telephone changed the way ordinary people communicated and when it really started to, on a broader scale, replace the telegraph?
Yeah, I think we've started to talk about this a little bit. The early history of the telephone is really as a business device. That's how it's marketed. And then fairly quickly, the folks at the top decide that they can also market it for regular people to have conversations in their homes. The telephone is unique from the telegraph, although you could argue that perhaps the more shocking kind of innovation was the fact of any kind of simultaneous communication. But the telegraph was something that you had to go down to a telegraph office to use. And generally, people didn't know how to use it themselves. And you could communicate only one way, and it wasn't simultaneous. So the telephone is something that, for most of its history, a regular person can use without any intervention, without too much training. It's something that you can communicate instantaneously and in a two-way kind of fashion. And the telephone has dramatic impacts on the way that people communicate. The voices, it's sort of strange and creepy and scary to hear it disembodied in that way at the very beginning, just as it was to hear the idea of an unseen entity somehow communicating with you through a telegraph wire. In both cases, there were people that made spiritualist connections, that this is sort of ghostly in a sense. But it has a dramatic way on the impact on the way people communicate, because it has this kind of intimacy, because you can speak to somebody in your house, in your kitchen, in your bedroom, with the phone pressed right up against your ear. And it's unique. It feels very personal.
Also, for the first several decades, there weren't really long-distance lines. And so people would telegraph to the central office in the town. Then they would phone the message. And when we were researching in Bell's house in Nova Scotia, I was digging in a drawer, and I actually found a log of the long-distance telegrams that had come and then been phoned from town across the bay to Bell's house.
Interesting. I did not know that. So that finishes our official questions, but I'm going to end with a round robin of all four of them and asking them a question. And 60, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, something like that. Try not to go over 2 minutes. A quick round robin for the group before we go to the audience. Could you each offer a few words on how communications technology has evolved over the last 150 years and what that has meant for society? Ed, you're up first.
Well, I've read so much of Bell's material, I often wish I could tell him about all these things. And when I was reading, a lot of times he drew pictures of people, faces, and wires, and he called it speaking by wire. And he was fascinated with the idea. And I just think he would have been so amazed by what has happened. Now, it's not true that he hated the telephone. A lot of people wrote about that, and that he threw one out the window. That was not true. He did not want it in his room, distracting him. But I think he would have just been immensely. In fact, the problem is he just loved to read. He would stay up late at night reading the dictionary. I mean, the encyclopedia. And he would, the internet would be the end of him. I mean, he would just be reading forever.
Great. Josh?
Dramatically, it's evolved dramatically. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fun to speculate about what Bell would have thought about some of the innovations. And it's fun, I think, as a historian to look back 100 years ago or 150 years ago and see what people thought the present might be like. And in general, they're dramatically wrong. often comically wrong. Bell was pretty good. He was pretty good. He had a lot of predictions of technologies that resemble technologies that we use today, like fiber optic cables and things like that. I think I agree. I think Bell would be fascinated by the world of communications that we live in now. And Bell is unique in terms of at least inventors that we have in our collections at the Library of Congress, in that it's very common for inventors, it seems, who come up with one big heroic invention in the 19th century or in the early 20th century to get a little bit obsessed with that invention. They spend the rest of their career after this moment of discovery defending their legacy or defending their patent rights. They get sucked into the business of it. Bell liked being rich and famous. I think that's clear. He says that he was looking forward to that when the patent was in process. But what he really wanted was funding and fame that would allow him to pursue his ideas. He was less interested in bringing things to market. He was more interested in discovering things and making connections and learning new stuff. So he doesn't strike you as somebody that would have been fixed in his ways. He strikes you as someone who, if he had lived to be 200 years, he would have just continued to learn things. So if he had been around the whole time, I think he would have been right with the evolution of technology along the way.
That's great. I love that. Let's move on to Sheldon, please.
A couple things. One is, and this is picking up on what Josh said, what is Alexander Graham Bell, unlike Thomas Edison, had absolutely no interest in being a businessman. He invents the telephone. In the spring of 1878, he, with his new wife, Mabel, goes over for a long stay in England and never is actively involved with the business of the telephone or anything else. Basically, he wanted to study what he was interested in, as Josh has discovered. He was happy to come out on ceremonial occasions, like the opening of long-distance service between New York and Chicago or New York and San Francisco, but he was not a businessman. Hubbard, on the other hand, was, though he soon was displaced by the financiers he had to go to get the money to get the business going. But the company that he founded, it was founded on his patent, was founded by Bell and Hubbard and Sanders, is today's AT&T. I would agree that it took, well, first of all, it took tens of thousands of other innovations. AT&T was the parent, famous Bell Labs. And between 1925 and 1995, Bell Labs received 25,000 patents. Most of them related to the telephone. And before Bell Labs, there was a inventor nobody has ever heard of called Charles Scribner, who at one time in the early 20th centuries had more patents than anyone else in the United States except Thomas Edison, who were all for improvement in telephone switching. And as far as Bell as a visionary, it's all there in his writings. As Josh mentioned, there's a well-known among people who studied Bell letter to the English capitalists, where he predicts in 1878 first that telephone wires will go around either overhead or underground throughout a town, and anybody can call anyone else. But further, he envisioned a future when all of those towns' telephone systems across the country would be interconnected to each other, and people could talk across the country as easily as they could talk across town. And one final note, Bell also, I think Bell would be very happy. If you think about a telephone system, the early telephone systems in the 1980s, conceptually, you have transmission, getting the message, the voice from point A to point B. You have switching, making sure it goes from the right point A to the right point B. And you have the instruments used to connect to the network, telephones, later fax machines and modems and all this other stuff. Well, conceptually, that's the same thing in today's cellular system. You've got transmission, you've got switching, you've got instruments. And Bell foresaw all of that, and it's all there in the early telephone systems.
Thank you, Sheldon. And finally, we'll move to Brian.
As I always like to tell people, and I was doing a tour of the Homestead here, if somehow Bell could be transported to the 21st century, he would be blown away by the technology that we have. If you offered him a cell phone, he'd immediately probably start pulling it apart. He'd want to know how it worked. Much the same as he did when he took apart a human ear in the early years as he was starting to develop his ideas. In his own time, he saw how quickly the telephone changed society. One of the things he was most pleased about was the fact that people could get emergency services faster than they ever had before. Living in a time where if your house caught fire, you had to run to get help. You could pick up a phone and hopefully your house was still standing when the fire department got there. And again, he would be fascinated to see just where things have gone today. The fact that during a worldwide pandemic, we were still able to be connected with each other, maybe not in person, but certainly with all of our electronic devices. That was just something that would never have happened in his own time. However, I think he'd be questioning why we need to be connected all the time, why we have to carry that cell phone with us all the time, why people have their corporate phone and their own personal phone so that their bosses can get a hold of them anytime, day or night. Plus, at the same time, he would look at the younger generation. I always use my own nieces who sit in the same room and text each other, but don't actually speak to each other. So I think as someone who honestly felt that being able to speak face to face was very important, I think he'd really be scratching his head about that. But again, he was brought up with a philosophy given to him by his father. All three of the boys were taught, you don't complain, you solve the problem. And everything he did was to solve the problem. Even later on, after telephone exchanges, for example, were well in use. In the 1890s, he came up with an early automatic dialing system, which he never put into use because he realized how many operators would lose their jobs. So he solved the problem, but it wasn't the right time for it yet. So I think the fact that he would see us still solving problems with the technology we have would absolutely elate him.
Thank you for that. And I think there's two different types of people, the ones that seek out a problem and find the solution for it, and the ones that just find something new to do and different and then figure out where it fits into everything else. So it sounds like he was a problem solver. So we are now going to open the floor up for questions. So if you have any questions, you can come over to the microphone. I will ask you to give your name and then state who you're going to direct your question to. And try to keep it not like a real lengthy question. All right, thank you. Go ahead.
What a great panel. My name's Arthur Emeritus. Kind of two-part question. One is, I understand that the telegraph company kept those records, so people had no illusion of privacy. Did people making the early phone calls expect them to be private? And the second question is, when did teens take over use of the telephone? Is that post-World War II, or did they right away?
Is that directed to anybody in particular?
I'd like to address that.
Okay, go ahead, Sheldon.
Okay, the second part is teens took over the telephone as quickly as their parents would let them. On a mass scale, it's really a post-World War II thing when you start to have teens clamoring for their own extension phones for privacy. That's when that really takes off. Now, remind me of the first half of your question.
Illusion or expectation of privacy when they were making point-to-point phone calls that was different from the telegraph.
Was absolutely different from the telegraph. And indeed, from very early on, the operators were absolutely forbidden from listening in on a phone call. You made the connection at a manual switchboard, and then you moved on to make somebody else's connection. And you didn't pay attention to the call until the light went off saying that they were done and had hung up. The telephone company, AT&T, Bell System, had a policy not to ever read the content of individual calls. They might have to keep the call so they could bill correctly. I used to get asked regularly about the contents of phone calls on famous events. And the answer is AT&T by policy didn't keep those records. So I can tell you about, say, the first ceremonial call between New York and San Francisco in 1915. And that was a big PR event when auditoriums full of people listening to Bell communicate across the country with Watson. But I can't tell you who made the first commercial paid call. AT&T did not keep that record. So the privacy became one of the big selling points. And indeed, a lot of the early use of the telephone was by people who positively did not want to be gamblers, stock speculators.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll move on to Ed. Ed
Yeah.
wanted to add something also.
Regarding privacy, when I was a boy at the family place in Nova Scotia, we actually spoke over telephones that had been installed by Bell. And like many phone systems at that time, it was a party line. There were 11 houses on one phone line. And I would make a call as a teenager to my friends in town, and I could hear my aunts breathing on the phone.
Yeah.
And so when they got automatic dialing, it was a great innovation.
That's great. Thank you.
And Ed, wasn't it one of your aunts who would listen in? And if she thought the conversation was getting too racy, she would actually interrupt and tell you not to be talking about whatever that topic was?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
We won't ask how you know that. So we're going to move on to our next questioner. Vin, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us who you want to ask the question of, or if it's the whole panel.
Well, it's Vince Surf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. And in case you're wondering, I'm geek orthodox. This actually is not a question. It was an observation, and you just made it for me. In 1948, I lived in a house with 3 different homes, had party lines, and there was no notion of privacy at all. So the privacy notion may have been expected, but wasn't fulfilled until we got to the direct distance dialing and one phone and one number per house. So we share a common experience when other people were on the line, trying not to be noticeable, except you would hear the et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, thanks.
And the other problem is that you'd have to count. We were 6 short rings was our house. So we'd have to count everybody else's rings, whether somebody got 4 rings or 5 rings or 2 longs and a short. And we'd have to count all the way to 6 to get our phone calls.
Well, in fact, you listened for the other ring, so you would pick it up if it wasn't for you, so you could find out what was going on.
Thank you. I want to say that I've greatly enjoyed the stories we've heard today because I think we remember things a lot better if there's a story associated with it. So I hope you will remember a lot of this panel. I want to thank all of our panelists. Loved having you on here. Loved hearing your stories and the information that you have. Very interesting. And thank you all, both online and in the room, for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to our moderator, Jill Gostin, and our remarkable panelists for that insightful discussion. The story of invention is not only about ideas, it's also about the systems that protect, nurture, and enable those ideas to flourish. Our next conversation turns to the vital role of intellectual property in encouraging innovation and shaping the technologies of tomorrow. Our second panel is Protecting Ideas and Shaping the Future and will be led by moderator Louis Foreman. Louis?